About an hour from now, folks in Hoosick Falls hope to get some answers to a problem that's tainting their water supply.
And for the past several weeks now, the EPA has urged folks not to drink or even cook with the water because of dangerous levels of what's called perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA for short.
New developments right now on the water crisis in Hoosick Falls. A class action lawsuit has been filed by the law firm Whites and Luxembourg on behalf of the people living in the village. It's blaming St. Gobain and Honeywell International for putting the chemical PFOA in the water there.
Well, things got heated tonight at the village board meeting in Hoosick Falls, where people have been dealing with a contaminated water crisis really for months now.
People are fired up about essentially having to pay for poisoned water.
How do you know when mass hysteria sets in on any given place? In Hoosick Falls, it didn't begin with reports on the local TV station, while the crisis was unfolding for thousands of residents. No, it began with one man, really, and after personal loss, too. In this special piece made for radio by The Message, we will be taking a look at one of the many water crises affecting our country today. The only difference being this one hits home for many in our local upstate New York region. And for the sake of our story, it begins about 3 years ago when Hoosick Falls resident Michael Hickey loses his father to kidney cancer. Nick and I talked with Hickey not too long ago on how it all began.
Well, I guess I got a little bit more of an extensive role in it. I found the contamination. By doing some research roughly 2 years ago is really when I started the process. My father actually passed away 3 years ago this month, and a local teacher passed away a year after him. And after that, there's always a kind of a thought in our village that there's been a high rate of cancer. And people have assumed that there was something in the water. So after the teacher passed away, I decided to start to do a little bit of digging to see if there actually was anything to it.
What Hickey found was perfluorooctanoic acid, shortened as PFOA or C8, and the compound is notable for being found in a variety of household products, ranging from microwave popcorn bags to non-stick cookware. For many years, nothing was thought of the chemical, but in 2010, a science panel linked it to cancer among other deadly illnesses. And here's Hickey's understanding of the poisonous substance.
It's really been a sticky situation because of it being unregulated. In New York Department of Health really didn't know a whole lot about this when we started. And I really, to be honest, I think they've really just been educated on it in the last few weeks. That's it. Kind of is what it is because there's 60,000 unregulated contaminants out there right now. So you can't expect them to know all things. But the difference I think here with this chemical is that the science is already proven. We weren't trying to recreate the wheel. The studies that were done in DuPont, Ohio and West Virginia, that they spent a good amount of time and money. I think it was $80 million on the science panel to prove the 2 cancers and 5 other associated illnesses that go along with it for that panel. So that was a little bit of the frustrating part. New Jersey has a regulation as well. So the EPA regional administrator, she handles New Jersey, New York, and I think the Virgin Islands and Indian nations. And I imagine that PFOA will probably, at some point in time, be regulated across the country. Right now, I think it's a little bit tougher to go state by state. Obviously, some states are harder to deal with than others, getting legislation passed and whatnot. So, it's been a frustrating process, sure.
Now, the Department of Environmental Conservation recently identified St. Gobain Performance Plastics and Honeywell International as responsible for some of the PFOA in the town. And your father worked at St. Gobain Performance Plastics Factory for a few decades, right? Reading from these articles.
Correct. Yep,
When he was working there, they didn't realize that, I guess, did he even know PFOA was a byproduct then, or they didn't really know the dangers of that?
No, I don't think any of them knew. And to be honest, I don't think really even the Teflon industry knew, except for DuPont, until probably the stewardship program that rolled out, which was 7 years ago, saying that it needed to be out of all of the main mix that they used by the beginning of 2016. So I don't think there was malicious intent by St. Gobain or Honeywell. I think it's kind of one of those things that we're probably going to see more of, unfortunately. Looking into each one of these chemicals and everything, it's tough to do. And I think that they've actually changed their mix now from C8 down to C6, which there's kind of talk that it could be just as toxic as C8. But, it will take a long time to catch up on the research with that.
Now, I understand that when you went to the mayor, it was reported in some stories, I think in the Times-Union, Mayor David Borge, he didn't really let you test the raw water. What was that about?
He said that private citizens don't have access to raw water, which was, kind of upsetting, as I was a village board member at one time, and my dad was actually a village board member when he passed away. Actually a sitting board member when he passed away. So it was a little bit frustrating at that point. But I guess, legally, liability, I don't know if he talked to his counsel there.
What do you think of his handling overall of the whole crisis, I guess, the mayor's?
I think there's been frustrations throughout. There's no question about that, and I'm sure that he was a little bit frustrated with us as well.
Though noted for the faults on many occasions, it's easy to forget that local municipalities, the state government, and federal agencies aren't at the center of this crisis. Instead, that's a precarious place occupied by the corporate sector. Two factories owned by St. Gobain and Honeywell are the ones standing accused of dumping PFOA into the town's water supply. Here's Hickey's opinion on them.
St. Gobain is they're an enormous company. They have 190,000 employees worldwide, $60 billion a year in sales, and 440 companies under their corporate umbrella. So I think that there was probably a process. Knowing what happened at DuPont, the money that's there, that there's tied up in legal fees, and will probably go for another 25, 30 years until all the cases are heard there. I think it gets hard because everything is so litigious now, and the legal process takes a long time. And, St. Gobain, do I think they knew sooner? Yeah, I do. Do I wish they did more in the beginning? Yeah. The one thing I do wish is that in 2006 we built our brand new water plant that's only 400 yards away from St. Gobain building.
Wow.
At that point in time, I would have thought ethically, you come knock on the door and say, hey, you might not want to put that there. But, also I do realize that the people that are at the St. Gobain in Hoosick Falls are not the ones that are really calling the shots either. We're just one of the small, plants of the global monster, really.
According to the Albany Business Review, Honeywell officials have been meeting with state health officials to discuss their potential participation in a program to secure the water supply of residents who rely upon private wells. Do you think that these corporate entities should get involved in the repairing process? To what extent do you think they should be involved?
I think if they're willing, they have the resources, and they have more accessible resources financially than maybe the government does, as taking care of the entire state. I realize that we're kind of a small little village and town on the overall scale of New York. So if Honeywell is willing to get involved to help the situation, I welcome it. I think everybody should, because, when the news cameras go away and when, the Department of Health doesn't have this every day, we still need to follow through on this program. And if Honeywell is willing to, send somebody here or to help monitor the program or do whatever they can, I think that's a great thing.
Although we talked with Hickey over a month ago, this case has always stuck in my mind. I followed the stories that continued to be printed in newspapers and put on television. I saw the occasional tweet from government officials assuring us that everything was all right, and the same for some crusading journalists telling us anything but. It became pretty clear that this wasn't going away, so I reached back out to Michael Hickey, asked him how he was, asked him if I could speak with the town doctor Marcus Martinez, who had helped him uncover their water contamination. The doctor was busy that week, talking with Al Jazeera and the Huffington Post. So I continued some light reading. Well, maybe not light, considering it was a multi-chapter multimedia project carried out by the Huffington Post's Mariah Blake. It was the story of Parkersburg, West Virginia, where the same thing that was occurring in our backyard had occurred in theirs.
Last month, dozens of West Virginia residents filed a federal lawsuit against the chemical company DuPont. The case is one of thousands that have been filed against the company seeking compensation for damage DuPont caused to people's drinking water by leaking the chemical C8.
On that note, I couldn't think of any other place to turn other than where I first heard the letters PFOA. Award-winning investigative journalist from the Albany Times-Union, Brendan J. Lyons.
Hello.
Hello, Brendan. It's Connor.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you today?
Pretty good.
That's good. That's good. So yeah, you don't mind if I record this, right? I was gonna use it for my radio show next week.
Not at all.
All right, great. So yeah, I guess I'll just get right into it. Yeah, last December, you wrote for the Times-Union, Danger Lurks Below, the piece that showed the early signs of a link between contaminated water and alarming cancer rates in Hoosick Falls. So now, more than 4 months and 10 stories later, by my count, I have to ask, did you think this story would become this big?
I didn't know how it would go, this story, but what I was going to say, Connor, was that early in the reporting on this, which began a couple months before that first story, I remember talking to an environmental person who I was asking questions about, and interestingly enough, they provided that insight and said this is going to be a really big story. And it turned out they were right. I mean, it was amazing kind of how quickly that story blew up. I mean, there had been some limited news coverage, television and such, of the issue there, but I think that first story, which really pulled back the curtain on the state's arguably mishandling of the situation through that first year, as well as what led to the discovery, telling that story of Michael Hickey and Dr. Martinez and their concerns, sort of set that issue on fire, it seemed. Within days, you saw the state and the village kind of reverse their positions on the issue of PFOA.
Yeah, and it took the EPA 5 days. I think it was Judith Enck from the EPA to respond to the report that you had, which I think it was responding directly kind of to your report. Was that response too slow, or did they respond quicker than you would have thought?
I don't know. I think that as this issue has evolved, the EPA is such a massive agency, and I'm sure the Region 2 people won't admit it, and won't admit it publicly, certainly, that there's probably frustration on their part with, central office EPA, which has been where the holdup has been to set a national standard, a more strict standard on PFOA. What they have out there is kind of a general advisory, almost a recommendation that we think that PFOA at a level of 400 parts per trillion is safe for or is unsafe for short-term exposure. And so, but that number's been there, and that was the problem with New York State's response, is they keep saying it's an unregulated contaminant. But there's so much information out there about this contaminant, and certainly an agency the size of the New York State Department of Health would be on top of that information and be aware that other states such as New Jersey and Ohio have set very, very strict standards on PFOA. And some of these states, they've determined or believe that there's almost no safe level for that chemical in water, because when it's in your water, it means that you're going to consume it over a long length of period.
Yeah, and I think one of the most high-profile cases that I've read about is the one down in Parkersburg, West Virginia, with DuPont. That whole thing, that was really crazy. But anyways, moving on. I think one of the recurring trends I noticed in your stories is the prevalence of local and state officials' initial moves to brush this under the rug. In your experience as an investigative reporter, is this common to come across?
It depends on the issue, certainly. I mean, you do see efforts to contain scandals, efforts to contain, disasters. I think here, as our first story described, there was a concern, according to these residents, there was a concern by the mayor that making this public, putting it out and sharing the information and warning the public about the issue might undermine their efforts to revitalize this small, riverbend community in eastern Rensselaer County. And so, and there was a story I did, I think it was about four weeks ago or so, about the Center for Environmental Health, which is the unit within the state health department that's tasked with protecting the public's health. And they have what some former colleagues of theirs have described as a pattern of downplaying these types of situations. The mindset was, don't alarm the public, don't create panic, and don't draw attention to ourselves. The agency has denied that that's the way they do business, but some of the people who have worked in that agency, say otherwise.
Yeah, but when the EPA the EPA is sort of contradicting that when they say don't drink the water. They're the ones that are kind of stepping in, but at the same time, as you mentioned before, with the recommended level only being 400, and that's only recommended for the short term, right?
Right, that's correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, what about the state's response? You kind of alluded to it a little bit.
Well, that's where the most criticism has come in this issue, was that, while you could, some people have cast blame at the mayor, relied on the information he was getting from the state and county health department. But at the same time, he was also getting information from others about the dangers of PFOA as early as, I guess about 14 months ago. Mm-hmm. And so he was ignoring the information, arguably it seems, that wasn't in line with what the EPA was advising. He was ignoring it. He was hanging his hat on the information he received from the state health department. And the state health department, in turn, was certainly downplaying the risks. And putting out, what I found was conflicting information. They put out a fact sheet where in one part of the document it says normal use of the water, shouldn't be risky or cause any health effects. And then in another part of the document, it's referencing studies that have shown links to cancer, which they characterized as inconclusive. And I don't know what they based that on, in short, because those studies that were done as a result of that Ohio-West Virginia case, those were funded by DuPont as part of a class action litigation. And it was their studies, it was an independent science panel, and they were peer-reviewed studies that showed what is a probable link. The other thing you've seen here is, even recently I saw the town of Petersburg supervisor on a local television station professing, well, there's no reason to panic. And this is a town where they've found extremely high levels of the chemical. And he's saying, he said that he made the statement, no one has ever died from PFOA. I don't know that he can make that statement. And in the lawsuit in Ohio, in the class action lawsuit, there's 12 wrongful death claims. That 3,500 people who said they suffered bodily harm, 12 of them are dead. So I think it was just a statement maybe that could be attributed to ignorance of the entire issue and what's on the books out there in terms of PFOA. And certainly, the governor who has pointed fingers at the EPA, I think in part to, take the shadow off of his state health department a little bit. But all of these agencies certainly could have acted, swifter, I think, in warning the public about this chemical.
We've already seen 2 factory towns now affected by this crisis, and
these polyfluorocarbons. It was kind of a niche. It is a kind of a niche industry that's flourished in that sector. Along the New York-Vermont border, where you have these relatively small manufacturing plants that do specialized work in seal coating, electroplating. They make products that are heat resistant. Heat resistant in terms of electrical wiring in airplanes and things like that. Gore-Tex nonstick products and things. And so what you had for a long time in the 60s and 70s especially was you'd have, say, mechanical engineers or others who might work at one of these factories and then spin one off and start their own. And then you had workers often who would bounce between a lot of these manufacturing plants. And they were, they weren't like the stereotypical manufacturing, coal plant where, there's these giant factories with 100 feet high smokestacks and all these things. These are kind of low profile aluminum buildings. You drive by them, you're not even sure what's made in them. They're not that big from the outside when you look at them, And so they did have smokestacks. You can call them anything you want. They have different names for them, but basically they had smoke, or at least byproduct of their manufacturing process was going up out of those stacks, and that included PFOA. Well, I think anytime when you're dealing with the environment, it's an interesting topic, and it's one that we should care about as journalists, in part because it affects human health. It's here you have a situation in Hoosick Falls where people are buying houses and using the water that they're getting from the municipal well on the belief that it's good stuff, it's clean, and they're making baby bottles and cooking in it and all those things. So in the GE case, certainly that has been a Superfund site for years and years and years, and it's been a focus of widespread attention since at least the 70s. And so in that case, you had GE is a private company, so there's no way for us as journalists to file a Freedom of Information request to say, show us your records, tell us what you knew. In that case, when there was controversy over their dredging project that was approved by the federal government in the early 2000s, and they ordered GE to dredge the river. And when that process began, you had these small towns, Waterford, Half Moon, along with the Sergio County Water Authority, that said to GE, well, if you're going to stir up all these PCBs, we draw water from the Hudson River now, which was even questionable. And, you're going to imperil our ability to draw safe drinking water. So they sued them. They sued GE. And I started watching that lawsuit and following it, and it had hundreds of docket entries. And what I realized, what the breakthrough was there, was I realized, kind of in watching this, that there was discovery, that GE was being compelled to turn over records as this litigation got deeper and deeper. And because the plaintiffs were government agencies, I foiled them for the discovery materials, which in large part GE was demanding be kept under seal. GE did not want the public to know what it knew about PCBs and when. Arguably, even the hiring of a PR firm, they argued vehemently that was attorney-client privilege because somehow the public relations people who were trying to, steer their multi-million-dollar effort to dissuade dredging, that somehow that was a part of their legal strategy. And so, but anyway, in the end, there's tens of thousands of documents that were never unsealed, which might be very revealing, but the ones that were unsealed were interesting. It kind of, shed light on what GE knew, when they knew it, and more importantly, it exposed this, very, very expensive effort that they undertook for years and years to try to change public opinion about PCBs and dredging. There were, hundreds of people would pack these meetings, anti-dredging advocates, and many of them were there because of the efforts of GE. They even put out their own newsletter. It looked like an official newspaper, that you wouldn't know it was written by them. And of course, for me, the big score there was it took some nudging, but getting the videotaped deposition of Jack Welch, which no one had ever really seen, the unedited, uncensored Jack Welch, answering questions about his days at the helm of GE and what he knew about PCBs and stuff, and it was really neat to have that first.
And just working off of, you mentioned the PR firms that GE consulted with. I noticed in one of your stories that apparently Hoosick Falls, the lawyers representing the village, have retained the same PR firm.
That's right. And
could you explain what that firm does for them, or?
Well, isn't that interesting? I mean, the interesting thing there to me, and the story initially that made it kind of, I guess you could say, controversial, is that the hiring was done arguably secretly. So this firm, B&A Associates, was hired by the private law firm that was retained by the village, and in turn, that meant that the hiring didn't have to be voted on by the village board, disclosed to the public, it seems, and so it was basically kept secret. And the reason I started to figure it out, if you will, was after the first story in December. We were doing additional stories, and at some point, the village's website started to look very professional. There was a timeline created. There were documents. It was, it seemed like an effort to reverse the tide against them. They were being accused of being secretive, of being, trying to bury the situation, and suddenly there was this effort to be more transparent. And I thought, boy, that looks polished. That looks professional. And I started asking questions, and finally I, ran into a source who said, well, they hired B&A Associates to do it. That's who's doing the work. And when I asked them and confronted them about it, they readily admitted it, or at least reluctantly admitted it. And so, it was just interesting, and it infuriated some people, or at least angered some people, because they felt that a small village like that shouldn't be worried about image and PR, and that they should simply just tell the truth and answer the questions, not have a PR firm that maybe is behind some of their answers and decision making. This is a story that's going to endure. It's going to go on arguably for years, because once it's declared a Superfund site, now there's going to be a protracted legal battle between the state, possibly the EPA, and the companies about what their responsibilities are in terms of cleanup and remediation. The St. Cobain has been very responsive, according to the village residents. They've quickly, as soon as they were notified, they notified the EPA of the situation. They have provided free water to people and such, but where they're going to probably dig their heels in is when the state government or somebody comes along and says, you're going to have to dig up all of these areas and remediate the soil and do all of these different things that now you may be talking a price tag that's in the millions and millions of dollars. That's where I think the corporations might say, well, wait a minute, because St. Cobain is going to say, we've only owned the site since '99, and there were companies, 3 or 4 other companies that owned this site for 50 years before us. And the other issue is going to be that people in that village, filtered or not, are going to be forever wondering about the water that they're putting in their coffee pot, because until it's in a completely new source where the PFOA is not in the water rather than just being filtered out of it, I think they're going to be reluctant to feel comfortable with that.
There were residents and there were some of the most trusted reporters on the case. But where was the outsider? Where was the public health expert to add fuel to the fire of such a touchy subject? Well, that's where Dr. Richard Clapp of Boston University comes in, as he explains to me in his own words the danger of PFOA-laced water.
The problem with it, as far as humans are concerned, is that once it's in your body, it stays for a long time, years. And as we learn more and more about what health problems that results in, it's becoming more and more of a matter of public concern, like it is in New York State.
What is, in your estimation, the most susceptible way for humans to consume PFOA?
Well, water is the most likely, and it's in water supplies in many parts of this country. So, as a fellow public health expert, a friend of mine said, if you want to get a lot of people exposed to something, put it in their water.
You end one of your papers saying the U.S. should call for a risk assessment and chemicals policy overhaul as related to perfluorinated compounds in PFOA. Do you still stand by this, and if so, why?
Yes, I still stand by that. The Federal Toxic Substances Control Act is actually being revised right now, so that policy overhaul is already underway. It's in the Senate, I believe, at the U.S. Senate at this point. And then as far as PFCs, perfluorinated compounds, we're still catching up with what they are and what they do in the human body and what health effects result. So therefore, what levels should be considered a safe level of exposure. And that still needs to be done. I mean, it's underway at the EPA right now for drinking water. States are looking at it as well. Different states have come up with different conclusions about it, but that needs to continue.
I tried to cover my corners on this story. I really did. I spent hours contacting the DEC, the DOH, the EPA, and even Mayor David Borge for any words they could contribute to the story. From the DEC, I was met with a flurry of press releases speaking on their department's behalf. From the DOH, a little more of the same, with both state-level agencies saying they'd get back to me about recorded interviews. And then I directly emailed Judith Ank, regional administrator for the EPA in New York, and appointed by President Barack Obama as listed on her webpage's bio. She said all my questions were good, and that one of her colleagues from the press office would be reaching back out to me. Eventually. As for the mayor, it only took one email from me for him to clarify that the best way to answer questions was via email. He mostly reiterated what had been said by many before him in a 6-paragraph message. But then I had an idea. Instead of being declined interviews and forced to wait for interviews, why not make use of clips just like these?
Yeah, you can have a number of very important issues, and we do. I want to see the overall filtration device installed and then get the test results once that filtration is installed to make sure the levels are down. And then I think we can breathe a sigh of relief.
And so concludes the special report on PFOA in Hoosick Falls for the week. I know you're probably thinking we were just getting started, and let's have some more Governor Cuomo over the airwaves, but this is really something best saved for next week, along with a few other personal testimonials. If there's something I've learned in covering a story like this, it's that subtle battle lines are being drawn. On one hand, you have the elected and appointed officials who seem to have all the important answers. There are corporate entities worth billions fighting for the quickest and quietest resolutions. And then you have lawyers on both sides who, as lawyers, are fighting for the best interests of their clients. And oh, yes, how could I forget? You have regular old people sitting at ground zero, like Michael Hickey, who describes his town here.
And the tough thing about this, too, is that we're a blue-collar town all the way. And I think there's an assumption, too, that the lifestyle is a little bit harder, maybe. The factory workers tend, kind of labeled this way, would be smokers and drinkers, and maybe, kind of that could be a reason for the high rates of cancer. And I think maybe it was downplayed a little bit for a long time because of that. So unfortunately, we didn't find this sooner. But overall, there's a lot of cancer here.
A special thanks this week to so many different sources. Of course, you have Michael Hickey, Brendan J. Lyons of the Albany Times-Union, and Dr. Richard Clapp of Boston University. Also, big thanks to CBS 6 for some of the TV clips you heard, as well as those choice words from the governor. And as always, a huge thank you to Marsh Sound for his sounds, of which we used a couple this week. Without him, you'd just be hearing plain words, and who can like that exactly? Once again, this is a production made possible by WCDB Albany, 90.9 FM, and now back to the message.